Hello and welcome to today's lessons on rudimenting theory. We are looking at the part 2 of elements of rhythms, and today we are going to shift our attention to three things: the pulse, the tempo, and then the meter. But before that, let's look at the previous lessons. We learned in our previous lessons that musical time is represented by symbols called durational values, and they may be dotted and non-dotted. And then we also looked at durational values and then the specific components and specific ways on how they are drawn. We also looked at durational values being proportional to one another, and then we also looked at the last in which is their possible rests in relation to one another. Today we are going to talk about pulse, tempo, and then meter. Let's look at our goals for today. We are going to define the elements that makes up the rhythmic organization, and then we are also going to talk about the perception of tempo. We will also talk about time signatures, that is the perception of simple and compound time. Then lastly, we'll talk about how these elements interact in music. Now, we perceive the organization of time in music in terms of three fundamental elements. So, what are the three fundamental elements or the three basic elements in the organization of time in music? The first one, we'll just mention it and then we'll go through it. The first one is the pulse. The pulse or the beat talks about the background or the heartbeat of a piece of music. Okay, we'll also look at the second one, which is the tempo. The tempo, which is the rate, is talking about how relatively fast or slow the speed of the music is, or at which we perceive the pulse in the music. So it is how fast or slow the speed of a music is, or how we perceive the pulse in a music. Then we also talk about the last thing, which is the meter, and it's talking about the ratio, that is the durational values being assigned to represent the pulse and then being organized in discrete segments in a piece of music. Now let's look at the very first two, pulse and tempo. We'll talk of pulse. What is pulse? Pulse or beat is regularly recurring underlying pulsation that we perceive, and it compels music to progress in time. Now, pulse makes us react kinesthetically to music, or maybe in other words, it compels motion. It helps us to tap our feet, it helps us to dance, it helps us to march, or even it helps us to feel the pulse internally. In a piece of music, some durational values are assigned to the pulse, and all durational values are proportionally related to that fundamental background pulse. So when we talk of pulse, pulse is a regularly recurring background pulsation in music. It is something that is occurring, okay? It is recurring over and over. So it makes us to react kinesthetically to music, and it helps us to tap our feet. So you can see a music being played and somebody just nodding the head or tapping the feet. That is the reaction the music is giving us. And then we also look at tempo, and tempo is the rate at which we perceive the pulse. Okay, tempo is the rate. So we talked about the speed. The tempo would tell us the speed at which the pulse is being given. So it is the rate at which we perceive the pulse in time, and this one is indicated by metronome markings. Okay, so we can see from here we have some metronome markings with some tempo dynamic. Okay, metronome markings with some tempo dynamic. And then we said a metronome marking, for example, is equal to 120 means that the pulse progresses at 120 beats per minute. That is 2 beats per second. And often in practice, the background duration value will be drawn and assigned to a metronomic value. So you could see that there are values. The is showing that crochet is equal to 120 BPM, or moderato BPM is equal to 100. So you sometimes encounter the mark in BPM, which means beats per minute. Now, when we go to the next one, we are looking at meter and then time signatures. When we talk of meter, what is meter? Meter is expressed in music as a time signature, and this determines four fundamental ways. So we will say that meter is the ratio of how many of what type of pulse values are grouped together. And simple meter divides the pulse into two equal proportions. Okay. So when we talk of meter, we'll say that it's expressed in music as a time signature, and it determines the four. That is one, which durational value is assigned to represent the fundamental background pulse. And then the second one is how these pulses are grouped together in discrete segments. Then the third one is how these pulses naturally subdivide into lesser durational values. And then the fourth one is the relative strength of pulses within segments or groupings of pulses. So the meter expressed in music is determined by these four, which durational values is assigned to represent the fundamental background pulse, how these pulses are grouped together, how these pulses naturally subdivide into lesser durational values, and then the relative strength of pulses within segments or groupings. Time signature consists of two numbers, one over another, placed at the beginning of a composition, and then they may occur anywhere in the composition where meter change is required. But remember, they are never written in fractions. Okay, they are never written in fractions. So you can see that time signature is written just after the clef. Okay, and as we said, they consist of two numbers, the upper number and then the lower number, and it is occurring, or it may occur anywhere in the composition where meter change is required. So you can see that the first top, or the first number, shows the number of beats per bar. So this one is showing as the number of beats. So in this case, this one is 2 beats. If you look at this one, this is going to give us 4 beats. So this one shows us the number of beats per bar, and then the second one shows us the value or bit unit that receives 1 bit. So the value of this, in our previous lessons, we said that the value of this is what? A crochet. So if that is the case, the number of bits in a bar, so the number of the crochet bits in a bar is 2. So in this bar, you could see that 2 of the crochets are being placed here. But if you look at this one, it's going to show us that 4 of the crochet bits is placed in this bar. Now, simple and compound time. In order to understand meter fully, we must first determine the fundamental nature of the prevailing background pulse or beat. In given meters, we perceive beats as having the potential of being divided into two ways. The first one, as the prevailing background pulse may be subdivided into two proportionally equal portions. And these portions or these proportions may have the attribute, and then it may be labeled as simple meter or simple time. And then we have the second one, which is the prevailing background pulse may be divided into three proportionally equal portions. And then this attribute is being labeled as compound meter or compound time. And we name meters according to two criteria. The very first one is it simple or compound time? And how many prevailing background pulses are grouped together? So let's look at how this can be achieved. Now, if we look at this diagram over here, we can see that the meters have been grouped. Okay, this is the simple division of given duration. So this one is 2, this one is 2, this one is 2, this one is 2, and this shows that the prevailing background pulses have been divided into two proportional equal portions. So you could see that this one has been divided exactly into two, this one has been divided exactly into two, this one has been divided exactly into two, and this one has also been divided exactly into two. When we look at the second one, as the compound divisions of given duration, this one has been divided into three, this one also into three, this one also into three, and we say that the prevailing background pulse may be divided into three proportionally equal portions, and that is the compound time. So this is the simple division and this is the compound division. Now when we look at this, we are going to look at the simple meter, but a meter being expressed as time signature indicates how many beats are grouped together in conjunct units. Okay, so um, we are looking at the simple meter, but before that, a time signature, whereas the pulse is divided into two portions, and then two pulses are grouped together, are called a simple duple. If there are three pulses which is being grouped together, they are simple triple, and so forth. We can have simple quadruple. Okay, and then a time signature, whereas the pulse is subdivided into three portions, are also called compound duple. That is three pulses, compound triple, and so on and so forth. So we look at the simple meter. Now let us address simple meter first. Let's analyze this by answering two questions concerning the stated time signature. Okay. One, for the top number, how many, or in other words, how many prevailing background pulses are grouped together? That is the first question that you should ask yourself when you get a simple meter. Then for the bottom number, which is telling us of what kind, or in other words, what durational values has been assigned to represent the prevailing background pulse. So the time signature 2/4 has two quarter notes grouped together, and therefore we label them as simple duple. Okay, simple duple. So we can say that the very first one, this one is a simple duple time. Simple duple, simple duple, simple duple. But why are these simple duple? Because this one can be divided into two. So we can have 2 of a 16th note, 2 of an eighth note, 2 of a quarter note, and 2 of a half note. Okay. In Renaissance music, specialized symbols were employed that were the forerunners of time signatures. And then these symbols determined how relatively durational values were held in proportional to one another. But we still continue to employ two holdovers from this system, the common time and then the cut time. Other names for cut time are maybe the match time. Some people call it the alabreve. Okay, so that is for the simple time. And then we can also say that the characteristics of individual time signatures are perceived in multiple layers that can be reduced to three basic levels. So as we said, the prevailing background pulse or music or beats, sorry, the first division, and then the subdivision. So the characteristics of individual time signatures. Okay, for every time signature that you have, it is being perceived in multiple layers, and it has been grouped into three basic levels. That is the prevailing background pulse. So you ask yourself, what is the prevailing background pulse or beat? You ask yourself the first division, and then you also ask yourself, can it be subdivided into other divisions? So the characteristics of individual time signatures are here. So the pulse is telling us the fundamental background pulse. The first division is telling us the level determining pulse division into two portions or three portions, and then the subdivisions is the subsequent divisions into smaller values. So we can look at this table here. This is our pulse. As we said, this is our pulse. This is in simple duple time. So this is our pulse, and our pulse is 1 1 1 1 1 1, and then you can see that the first division of this pulse is grouped into two. Okay, it's grouped into two. So one out of this, you have two of this, and then this one has also been divided into two of this. That's the first division. Okay, so we made an emphasis that the prevailing background pulse or beats, and then the first division, that is the level that will determine if the pulse divides into two equal proportions. So this one is being divided into two equal proportions. Then we look at the subdivisions, how the first division can be subdivided into smaller values. So we can see that this one can still be divided, this one can still be divided into smaller values. So we use the table, yes, this table, to map out time signatures and their components, organizational layers. Let's go to the next one, the compound meter. Understanding compound meter is somehow complex, and it has to go through a lot of preparatory statements to assist in the comprehension. Okay, so for the compound duple time, list 6/8 notes in two groupings of three in the first division row. Okay, but before we can get to that, let's talk about what it actually means. So let's prepare ourselves and our mind before we can. Now, compound meters have certain characteristics that will enable prompt recognition. If you locate or if you see a compound meter, the first one is the characteristics. Okay, and then if you have to locate the characteristic, the first one will give you the upper number being a 3 or a multiple of 3. Okay, the upper number, which is 3 or a multiple of 3. The second one is the prevailing background pulse must be a dotted value. We've talked about dotted notes in the previous lessons. But remember, in compound meter, the pulse must have the capacity to divide into three equal proportions. And then the C is subdivisions of the background pulse are usually grouped in sets of three by the use of beams or ligatures. And the next one we'll talk about is a compound meter may be perceived as a simple meter depending on the tempo. Because if a tempo is low enough, any compound time signature may be perceived as a simple meter. Yes. And in practice, this is limited by style and context in composition. So, in theory, any compound meter may be perceived as a simple meter depending on the tempo that it is. And then in compound meter, the written time signature represents the level of first division and not the pulse. Remember this. In compound meter, the written time signature represents the level of first division and not the pulse. In order to find the pulse value in compound time signature, we use the time signature table. Okay, so we list the first division values, that is the written time signature, in groupings of three. Then we sum these to the dotted values representing pulse, and then we list them accordingly in the table. But as with simple time signatures, we employ the same time signature table to graph compound time signatures. Okay, so when we look at statement 3, it says in compound meter, the written time signature represent the level of first division and not the pulse. So in compound meter, let's look at how this is going to work out. So for the compound dipole time signature, we list 6/8 notes in two groupings of three in the first row. Okay, so we are going to list them. I told you that in this case, the pulse doesn't come here. Okay, statement 3 of what I mentioned, the pulse doesn't come here, but we focus on the first division. Okay, so we list 6/8 notes in two groupings. These 6/8 notes, these 6/8 notes, these 6/8 notes in two groupings of three in the first division. Now, the next one we are going to do is to sum these groupings of three notes into dotted values. We are going to sum these groupings of three into dotted values. That's 2/8 notes equals a quarter note. The additional quarter notes represented by a dot. Okay, so the example here will give us that. So you see that the pulse is a dotted crochet, and we sum this one into three dotted notes or three divisional values. The third one or the last one is we draw subdivisions of the first division values in the subdivision row. So let's look at how the subdivisions are going to be. So the first division is being grouped in three, and then this is the subdivisions. So you could see that a quiver here will give you two semiquiver, a quiver here, two semiquiver, a quiver here, two semiquiver. It's the same with this, two semiquiver, two semiquiver, two semiquiver. So this one can also be subdivided into this. A first division can be subdivided into that. Now, let's look at the compound meter and their respective labels. So a compound dipole will have 6/16, 6/8, 6/4, 9/16 because this one can be divided into two first divisions. Okay, when we go to compound triple, this one can be divided into three first divisions. Okay, 916, 98, 94, 12, 16. So it means that we have three groupings or a multiple of three. Now, compound quadruple is a grouping of four: 12, 16, 12, 8, 12, 4. We have a grouping of four. So you can divide them into four because 4 times 3, okay, will give you the will give you the 12. Okay, so it is being divided. The first division is being divided into four proportions. That is why we have the compound quadruple and compound triple. The first division is being divided into three, and then the compound duple, the first division is being divided into two. Note that simple meter divide all values into two subdivisions in each level of the table, and compound meters divide the first division level into three. Subsequent divisions are divided into two. So you should be very careful about this then. Okay, it is simple meters that divides their values into two subdivisions in each level of the table, and compound meters divide the first division level into three. So you should be very careful about that. Simple triple, which is interpreted as a compound meter. Some simple triple time signature may be perceived as either simple or compound, and again, depending upon the tempo. Okay, so in practice, there is a limited list, and then the time signature 316, 38, 34 may be perceived as simple triple if the tempo is relatively slow. But in other words, we perceive the lower number, that is in 316, the lower number is 16, in 38 the lower number is 8, in 34 the lower number is 4. We perceive these lower numbers of the time signature as the fundamental background pulse values. Okay, so as the tempo for any of these becomes relatively faster, we cease to perceive the lower number as pulse. Instead, we perceive the lower number as the first division of a compound meter. So you could see the table here: simple triple and then compound single. So you could see simple triple, the time signature here is what, 3 4, and the pulse is 1 2 3, 1 2 3. But if you compare it to the compound single, it's the same 3 4, all right, but the pulse is a dotted minim or a dotted half note, which is also equivalent to 3. Okay, but if you subdivide it, you could have the first division of a simple triple being 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Okay, and then this compound single first division will be 1 2 3 1 2 3. So as we said, it depends on the tempo or how faster we perceive the values. And then the subdivisions can be 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. But the subdivision of a compound single can be 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. So you could see that simple triple has been interpreted as a compound meter in this form. Okay, so um in the next section, these fundamental elements of sounds and symbol and time will be placed in full musical context, okay, by uniting them with common notational practices, and then we will understand more of how these things work in order to associate them in the given context that they have been given. So the overview of the whole thing, you should be able to define and understand a pulse, which is in relation with beats, the tempo in relation with the rate or the speed, and then the meter in relation with ratio. And then you should also recognize and analyze simple time signature. That is a simple meter. You should be able to recognize and analyze them by grouping them into poles, first division, and subdivisions, and then they must have equal bearings or divided into two equal proportions. You should also be able to understand compound meter and recognize and analyze them in a time signature. Okay, so what a simple meter means and a compound meter means, you should be able to understand how they work. And then lastly, you should also understand that time signatures that may be perceived as either simple or compound are as such, and why are they perceived in that way. Okay, so using the time signature table as a tool for graphing time signatures, you can be able to perceive um, the time signature as either being a simple or compound time. Thank you for your time, and I hope to see you next time in our next lesson. Have a wonderful day.